Okay, Shalom Aleichem everybody. We're up to Daf Lamed Aleph. It's the last blot of the second parak. It's 3 lines from the top. Itmer. Chatzi zayis chutz lazmanoi, chatzi zayis chutz lemekoimoi, v'chatzi zayis chutz lazmanoi. So in order for a machshavas pigel to passel and to become pigel, to passel the carbon and become pigel, and give somebody karus if he eats from that basar, the machshava has to be in a kazayas basar. Now, what happens if the kohen has a machshava first chatzi zayis, chutz lazmanoi, which is a chatzi zayis for pigel, then he interrupts that machshava with a chutz lemekoimoi diga machshava, chatzi zayis chutz lemekoimoi, and then chatzi zayis chutz lazmanoi again. So the two bookends of the machshava, so to speak, is chutz lazmanoi. Combined, that would constitute pigel, but it was interrupted in the middle with a machshava of chutz lemekoimoi. Omar Rava, so Rava says, "Vayikatz kiyoshan hapigel." It's like the pigel awoke from its sleep. Why? Because in the beginning you had a chatzi zayis, machshavas pigel al chatzi zayis. Then it was interrupted. It's called sleep, right? It went to sleep because it was interrupted by chatzi zayis chutz lemekoimoi. So as soon as the machshava, the last machshava of chatzi zayis chutz lazmanoi kicks in, so now you awoke the dormant machshava of chatzi zayis chutz lazmanoi from the beginning, and now it's mitztaref and it becomes pigel. Rav Nuna Amar Irav Machshavas Havi. No, Rav Nuna says doesn't work. It's called Irav Machshavas, and it can never become pigel. It never awakens the way Rava says. Omar Rava. So Rava says Mina Minallah. What's my raya that Vayikatz Keyoshen Pigel, that even though it was interrupted with the thought of Chutz Lemekoimoi and it, so to speak, became dormant, all of a sudden it comes back to life? What's the makar for this chiddush? So Rava says, Menoah Minala, the Tanan, the Mishnah Taharis. Yeah? Halacha is that oichlin that are tameh cannot be matama others if it's less than a kibetza. It has to be a kibetza to be matama others. Okay. What happens? Kibetza oichel rishon. You have a kibetza oichel which is rishon latama. Okay, beitza oichel sheni, and you have an oichel which is sheni l'toma. So, what is rishon and sheni? Rishon and sheni means like this: there's a hierarchy of tumas. The top, or the most chomer diga tumah, is an avatoma, and there's a ganze sugya of avatoma. It's basically 11 type of tumas are called avatoma. They're matama odom and kalim, and that's the most chomer diga tumah. Okay. Now they're like lenient tumas. There's a tuma of rishon latuma, which is something which became tuma from an avatuma, right? And then you have a sheni latuma. Sheni is what it touched a rishon, so it's downgraded. Okay, so what happens if you have a kibetza oichel, which is rishon latuma, and a kibetza oichel, which is sheni latuma? Now shabololon zebazeh, you mixed it up. So you have in this mixture, half is rishon, half is sheni. So the halacha is, the din is rishon, it has a din of rishon latoma. Why? Because the bottom line is, it has a kazayis rishon in the mixture. So if it has kazayis rishon in the mixture, the halacha is that if it touches oichel acher, that oichel that it touches becomes sheni latoma, because this entire bundle of food, even though part of it is sheni, part of it is rishon, it has a din rishon. Chilkan, but what if you're machalik that to two chalakim, you take again rishon and sheni, put it together. While it's together, it has a din rishon. As soon as you separate it, now it has a din zeh sheni v'zeh sheni. Why? Because it could be that in each one there's only a chatzi kazayis of rishon, which is not enough to be matama. Okay, hachazav ve'irvan vaist ois, that if you put it back, Rava says, now that chatzi zayis from that half and the chatzi zayis of rishon from the other half is awakens, and rishon have it becomes rishon again. So that's how I know that it's choizer v'neir, it's called. It's awakened. Memai asks the Gemara, how do I know that choizer v'irvan in that Mishnah and Taharis it's rishon? Mediktani Seifa. Take a look at the Seifa of the Mishnah. It says nofel zeba atzmoi v'zeba atzmoi. If after you split it up, again, order of events, chronological order, right? You have a kazayis of rishon latoma, kazayis of sheni latoma, then it's babul on zeh b'zeh. Now you mixed it. Now you separated it again. So now each one, zevazez sheni latoma. Now what happens if each sheni latoma, each half, falls into a kicker of truma? Okay, pslua. Now it passes the truma, because truma can become a shlishi latoma. That's the chumra of truma. Usually oichlin can become a shlishi. Truma, yeah. Okay, so now the truma becomes a shlishi. Okay, because each one was a sheni. So sheni makes the other, the third oichlin, a shlishi. Naflu shnein ka'achas. If they both fall in together, asua shniya, then it becomes a shniya. Why? Because you have over there a din, you have a combination between the two, you have a rishon, right? You have a rishon. The truma becomes a shniya. Why? Because it's chayzer v'neir. So anyway, Rava says from here that here you see that if you have less than a shear and then you're mitzdaref it, even though there was a hefsek in the middle, there's a concept of chayzer v'neir. Rabbi Yoel says no. Hasam ikashiyura. To begin with, when you started, there was a kezayis, or there was a kibetza, excuse me. Over there, the shir is kibetza. There was a kibetza of rishon latoma. And now you have a kibetza of sheni latoma. So each one had enough to be matama something else. So maybe that's why you say chayzer v'neir. But over here, machshavas pigel, what's the brisa talking about? Where you had a machshavas chatzi zayis chutz lazmana. You never had a shir over here. Said chatzi zayis chutz lazmana, then you interrupt the chatzi zayis chutz lamekayim, and then you add another chatzi zayis chutz lazmana. So B'kahai Gavner, Ramnuna says you don't have a raya that it would be chayzer v'neir if you combine the last chatzi zayis chutz lazmana to the first one. Okay. Amar Ramnuna says, Mano Amina Allah. How do I know that you never say, you don't say chayzer v'neir? That nan, ha'oichel shenitmo ba'avatoma. What happens if a oichel touched avatoma and becomes a rishon? V'shenitmo bivladatoma. Or oichel, after it touched a rishon latoma, right, it becomes a sheni. Mitztarif and zemzeh, latama b'kalsha b'shneim. Can mitztarif, right? So if you have a rishon latoma and a sheni latoma, just fancy words of saying rishon and sheni latoma mitztarif, to what? To become a sheni latoma. My love, afagav d'hoder malya. Even if you added another piece of rishon, it's not chayzer v'neir. So you have a raya. It's not chayzer v'neir. The Gemara says no. You don't have a raya. It doesn't say that. You made a diak like that. Maybe you can't make that diak. Mishnah is not talking about it. But avad, if you would add another chatzi zayis of oichel that's rishon latoma, it would be chayzer v'neir, the first chatzi zayis, before it was nis'arev with the sheni latoma. Okay, b'kitzur ha'maisa, we have a machloikus again. Machloikus, each one brought a makar, or tried to bring a makar to their opinion. Machloikus Rava and Rav Hamnuna. If a kohen has a machshavas pigel, first is chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu, then he interrupted with chatzi zayis chutz lamekayma, and then he goes with chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu again. Machloikus, whether it's chayzer v'neir machshavas pigel. Okay, Kiyosir Avdimi Omar, chatzi zayis chutz lamekayma, v'chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu, the chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu. What happens when the two machshavas of chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu are next to each other? Right, you start off with chatzi zayis chutz lamekayma, and then you have chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu, and then you add chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu. So they're next to each other. Tani Bakarpara said, it's pigel. It's for sure pigel. Since the chatzoy zaysim of chutz lazmanu are next to each other, you had it one after the other consecutively, so it's pigel. Why? Because ein chatzi zayis moyo, right? The chatzi zayis is not moyo b'makim kezayis. Yet you can't consider the chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu, the first chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu. Sorry, the chatzi zayis chutz lamekayma is not enough to prevent the two chatzi zayisim of chutz lazmanu that are next to each other. So, ein chatzi zayis of chutz lamekayma moyel b'makim kezayis. Ki also Rav and Omar chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu, the chatzi zayis chutz lazmanu, the chatzi zayis chutz lamekayma. What happens if you have the two chatzoy zayisim of chutz lazmanu in the beginning? And in the end, you finished off the avodah with a chatzi zayis, a machshav of chatzi zayis chutz lamekayma. Tana Bakapar, pigel. Why? Because ein chatzi zayis of machshavas of chutz lamekayma by chatzi zayis at the end doesn't help moyel b'makim kezayis. Can't uproot the machshavas pigul that already occurred beforehand. Rav Ashi Masnahachi, Rav Ashi says, Chatzi zayis chutz lazamanoi, ukazayis chetzio lemekoima v'chetzio chutz lazamanoi. Okay, here it's a little bit different. You start off with the chatzi zayis chutz lazamanoi, and then you have a kazayis, which you split in half. Chetzio chutz lemekoima v'chetzio chutz lazamanoi. Torah kapara pigul. It's still pigul. Why? She'ein chatzi zayis machshav chutz lemekoima is not, doesn't help moyo. Doesn't help to prevent the tziruf of the two machshavas of chutz lazmanoi b'makom kazayis, as long as you have a kazayis between the two machshavas of chutz lazmanoi. Okay. Omer Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai says, again, we know that in order for a carbon to become pigul, the machshava has to be on a maisa achila, right? An achila chutz lazmanoi. What happens if chishav sheyechlu klovim lamachar? Yeah? What happens if you were going to feed it to dogs? Is that called an achila and it becomes pigul or not? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yanai, chishav sheyechlu klovim lamachar pigul. T'chsiv, v'asi Zevel, the wife of Achav, she was punished, and yoichlu haklovim bechelik Yisrael. Right? So the Zevel was the one who advised Achav to kill this fellow Yisrael who Achav wanted his field. Kitzur HaMaisa, the einish was that the klovim were going to eat her remains after she dies. So the pasuk there talks about the klovim eating Izevel, and it says yoichlu. So you see that when dogs eat, it's called an achila. And therefore, when the kohen has a machshava that he's going to feed it to dogs, lamachar, that's called a ma'isa achila, so it's pigul. Maskav l'rami elama'ato chishev sheteichlehu eish. What if he wants to give it as food, as fuel to the fire? Lamachar. So is that called an achila? Would it be pigul? The chsiv, it says in the pasuk, when it comes to punishing the Rishoyim, right, the Navi says, to achleyu eish lo nupach. So it's called achila. Achanami the pigul? Chitei machanami. If you're going to tell me yes, but nan, we learned in the Mishnah, lechel kazayis, or lahakter kachatzi zayis, lechel kachatzi zayis. Lahakter kachatzi zayis, the koyin, and a machshava of chutz l'zmanoi and a chatzi zayis, and another chatzi zayis l'aktorah, right? Two types of achilas. Kosher, it's kosher. Why? She'ein achila v'aktorah mitzdarfen. It can't be mitzdarf. Question is, what do you mean? If any consumption of eish is called an achila, so it's not achila v'aktorah, it's achila v'achila. Gemara says idavka b'lashon achila. If the machshava was b'lashon achila, he said, I'm going to feed it to the fire. Achanami. My skin of the avka b'lashon aktorah, I'm going to burn it. Right? And there, Lashon Achila L'chod, Lashon Aktar L'chod, the can't be mitzdarif. Boy Rav Ashi, Chishav Lechel Kazayis B'shnei B'nei Adam. Mao. What if he said, I'm going to feed a kazayis to two separate people, so each person is going to eat a chatzi zayis. Lamachar. So is that called pigul or not? The Gemara says, Bas machshava azlina de ikashira. In the machshava of the kohen, he was going to feed a kazayis lamachar, so that should be pigul. Basar oichlin is going to lekashira. Since the oichlin are two separate people and each one is only going to have a chatzi zayis, so maybe it's not pigul. Amar Abai Toshema, have a raya. Lechel kchatzi zayis la'aktik kchatzi zayis kosher. Why? She'ein achila v'aktorah mitzdarfen. Right? You can't be mitzaref a machshava of lechol chatzi zayis lamachar and lahaktir chatzi zayis lamachar. Oh, but a lechol v'lechol. But if you wanna, feed and feed, dumi the lechol lahaktir, which would be similar to a case of lechol lahaktir, which means two separate entities. You want to feed a chatzi zayis to one person and a chatzi zayis to another person. Sounds like it's mitzdarif. It's mitzdarif. Shemamina, the Gemara says, Taka, Abai has a good raya from our Mishnah that if a kohen has a machshava to be machal two separate people, each one a chatzi zayis, it's mitzdarif because you go basa the makra, basa the machshava, not basa the oichlin. Says the Gemara, Boy Rava, another shayla, Chishev lechel kazayis b'yeser mechdei achilas pras. We know in order for a kazayis to register as an achila, it has to be eaten in a certain time frame. It's called k'dei achilas pras. But if he eats it more than achilas pras, takes him longer to eat it, you can't call that really an achila. Mao, achilas gevoya medamin alei. Do we compare it to achilas gevoya? And achilas gevoya, we see that it doesn't have to be b'chdei achilas pras. Usually, it takes longer than that amount of time for the food or anything to be totally consumed. Or we compare that, the case of kazayis b'yeser medei achilas pras, to achilas hadyet, and therefore it would not constitute as pigul. Right. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaya, I have a raya. What's the raya? Toshima. Our Mishnah. Abaya attempts to bring a raya from the same Mishnah that he brought a raya just earlier, just before. Toshima. Lechol kchatzizayis la'aktik kchatzizayis kosher. Yeah. Mishnah says that if you have machshova to eat a chatzizayis lamachar and to feed the mizbeach, to be makter on the mizbeach chatzizayis lamachar, it's kosher. Shein achila v'aktar mitztarfen. These two machshavas cannot be mitztaref. Achila l'chod naktar l'chod. So the Gemara says, "Taivu delechol lahakter." The only reason why the Mishnah is kosher because of two separate types of consumption. One is through achila, one is through burning. Halachol v'lechol. But if it would be lechol v'lechol, which is dumya de lahakter, like lahakter, which means a chatzizayis and a chatzizayis that would take you, right, more than a chilas pras, dumya de lahakter, mitztaref. V'aktar b'yis dechilas prasu, and it sounds like it would be pigul. Okay, it passes the carbon. Gemara says, no, you can't have a raya from there. Why? Because dilma behase godol. It's not muchrach that haktara takes longer than a chilas pras. Why? Because it depends how big the fire is. If the flame is very big, it would consume the emurim a lot faster than achdei chilas pras. So I really can't have that diik from our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, lechol kechatzizayis, alaktik kechatzizayis, kosher. What happens if he has a machshava, right? That's the end of the Mishnah. He had a machshava that he's going to eat tomorrow a chatzizayis from the carbon. And he has a machshava that he's going to be maktir a chatzizayis from the carbon, lamachar also. Kosher, why? Because achila and aktar are not mitztaref. Says the Gemara, time the lechol lahaktir. Only reason why it's not mitztaref because one is lechol, one is lahaktir. Lechol v'lechol. But what happens if he has machshava lechol chatzizayis from avasar carbon and lechol chatzizayis from the emurim, which is davar she'ein darka lechol mitztaref, right? Because the only reason why, in the case of the Mishnah, it's not mitztaref is because the second chatzizayis you're being makter on the mizbeach, so achila and aktar can't be mitztaref. But what if you took the emurim that usually you would have been makter and you decided to eat it? So now you have an achila of davar she'darka lechol. Chatzizayis of basar. You have an achila of davar she'ein darka lechol, chatzizayis of emurim. Sounds like that would be mitztaref. Asks the Gemara, but how could that be? Oktani ratio lechol she'darka lechol en she'ein darka lechol loy. Right? The only time a machsheves lechol chutz l'zmanoi makes the carbon pigul is if it's davar she'darka lechol. And here you have a diak that even if it's davar she'ein darka lechol. Says the Gemara, Omer Rabbi Yirmiyah, Hamani, Rabbi Eliezer, the machad mechilz od mechilz mezbech, mechilz mech mechilz adam. Yeah, the safe is Rabbi Eliezer that man ashoich das zevach lechol dos darka lechol hak dos darka hakter kosher Rabbi Eliezer poisel. Rabbi Eliezer says machshavas pigul applies even if it's davar she'ein darka lechol, davar she'ein darka hakter. Abaye Omer afilo teim rabbanan. No, you could even say the safe is the rabbanan. V'loy teima, and don't be medayik that lechol chatzi kazayis shedavar shedarka lechol lechol chatzi kazayis davar she'ein darka lechol. Don't be medayik it that way, right? Don't be v'loy teima lechol v'lechol davar she'darka lechol ela imo ho lechol. V'lechoil, dover shedarkoi lechoil. In other words, what you should be medayik from there is holechoil v'lechol dover shedarkoi lechol. My kamashmalan, what will be the chiddush in that? I dover shedarkoi lechol kamashmalan. If you're telling me that shnei chatzoy zeisim, who both are undim lachilas, mitztaref lahashlan the kazayis to pass the carbon, meresha shamet mino. I already know from the resha. So what is the sefer teaching me with that diet? Yeah. So kechatzi zayis b'chotz kechatzi zayis l'machar pasol, right? It's pasol. Yeah, if it's chatzais chutz, chatzais lamacher, it's possible, it's not pigul. But if you had a chatzais lamacher and a chatzais lamacher, it'd be pigul. So you see, it's mitzdaref. So the Gemara says, and ilachol lahaktir, and if you're telling me that the chiddush is not for the diak, but for the etzem alocha, that achil and aktar is not mitzdaref, medukya the reisha shamit mena. I already know it also from the reisha. Lechol davar shdarka lechol en, shein darka lechol loy. I already know that it can't be mitzdaref unless it's davar shdarka lechol. Gemara says, Hashta, Amal lechol v'lechol dosh ne'er lechol lo mitzdaref, lechol haktim boy. This is even worse because this is haktara. Gemara says, lechol haktir itzterch. No, haktara. I wouldn't have necessarily known the din of lechol lahaktir is not mitzdaref from the reisha where you see that lechol masha darka lechol and lechol masha ein darka lechol is not mitzdaref. I wouldn't have necessarily know that. Why? Sagat chamina osmu delav ki orchik hamachashiv. Lamaisa, the second chatzizayis that he's eating is mamish ein darka lechol bachlal. Avalacha the behayke urche. Each chatzizayis beetzem whatever you're doing with it, that is the normal way to consume it, right? A mizbeach consumes it through aktara, and a person consumes it through achila. So maybe there the two machshavas can be mitztaref to pass the carbon and make the carbon pigul. Kamash malon. That's why the Mishnah of the Sefer teaches that even though hay darka lechol and hay darka lahakter, and you're doing each one ki urche, still ena mitztarefis and the carbon bleibs kosher. Hadron alach kalas vacham, hadron alach kalas vacham, hadron alach kalas vacham. Mirz Hashem will continue the Naya Perik Kol HaPsulin. All right, we'll stop here.